The Shadows in the Walls, a terrifying horror story of isolation and paranormal terror. The Shadows in the Walls. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway. A quaint cottage tucked away in the dense woods, miles from the nearest town. Emma and Jake had always dreamed of escaping the noise of city life and finding solace in nature. They had read about the cottage online, a charming old place with a rich history, now available for rent. The photos showed wooden beams, cozy furnishings, and a small creek babbling nearby. It was perfect, at least, that's what they thought. The sun had already dipped below the horizon when they arrived. The cottage, made of weathered stone and dark wood, loomed like a forgotten relic from a time long past. Emma could already sense the weight of the place, a heaviness that seemed to press down on her chest. But Jake was in high spirits, eager to explore. He grabbed their bags from the trunk and whistled as he approached the front door. "Come on, Em, stop sulking," he teased. "This is going to be great." Emma forced a smile, trying to shake off the creeping discomfort. They'd spent hours driving through winding roads, and she was just tired. Maybe a good night's sleep would do her good. The door creaked as Jake turned the handle, and they stepped inside. The air smelled musty, like old wood and dust. The low hum of the refrigerator was the only sound that greeted them. The living room was dim, lit only by the faint glow of the dying sunlight filtering through the windows. "Let's get a fire going," Jake said, heading for the fireplace. "It'll warm the place up." Emma wandered into the kitchen, her eyes scanning the shelves for something to drink. As she moved, something caught her attention. There was a narrow hallway leading deeper into the house. It felt like it had no end, stretching far beyond what should have been the house's limits. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the bottle of wine in the cabinet. "Hey, Jake, do you think this place is strange?" she asked, her voice tinged with unease. Jake didn't respond right away. She turned around to find him staring at something in the living room. His expression was distant, his eyes fixed on the far corner of the room where the shadows seemed to dance, as though alive. "Jake?" Emma asked, her pulse quickening. He blinked, as if snapping out of a trance. "Yeah, strange," he said, shaking his head. "But that's what we came for, right? Adventure." Emma wasn't so sure. She had always been sensitive to the energy of a place, and the cottage felt wrong. The air felt thick, oppressive. There were no other sounds except for the occasional creaks of the house settling, as though it was alive. Jake, oblivious to her growing anxiety, went about making the fire. Emma turned back to the hallway, her curiosity getting the better of her. She stepped lightly toward the passage, her footsteps muffled by the old floorboards. The hallway was narrow, the walls closing in around her as she moved. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a weak, yellow glow that did little to illuminate the darkness beyond. The floorboards creaked beneath her weight, but the sound was swallowed by the suffocating silence. She reached the end of the hallway, where a door stood ajar. It was a small room, perhaps a storage space or a closet, but as she peered inside, her heart skipped a beat. The room was empty except for a large, dusty mirror hanging on the far wall. The glass was cracked in several places, distorting the reflection in unsettling ways. She stepped closer, her hand instinctively reaching for the edge of the doorframe for support. A movement caught her eye, something flickering in the reflection. She spun around, her breath catching in her throat. The hallway behind her was empty. The light bulb overhead buzzed softly, casting long shadows on the walls. Her skin prickled, and a chill ran down her spine. She was about to turn away when a voice broke the silence. A low whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. "Leave." Emma froze. Her heart pounded in her chest. The voice had come from nowhere. It hadn't been Jake, he was still in the living room, oblivious to her distress. She glanced back at the cracked mirror. The reflection seemed to ripple, like water disturbed by something unseen. "Leave," the voice whispered again, more insistent this time. With a rush of adrenaline, Emma backed away, her eyes never leaving the mirror. She turned and rushed back to the living room, where Jake was now stoking the fire, completely unaware of what had just happened. "Jake," Emma said, her voice trembling. "I think we should leave." Jake raised an eyebrow, clearly puzzled. "What? Why?" "It's just a mirror, Em." I heard something," she said, her voice shaky. "A whisper. It told me to leave." Jake gave a nervous chuckle, but his eyes flicked nervously toward the hallway. "You're just tired, Em. Maybe it's the isolation getting to you." Emma shook her head. "No, Jake. Something's wrong here." Jake's expression softened, and he stepped toward her, trying to reassure her with a hand on her shoulder. "It's just your imagination. We'll be fine. Let's get some sleep and figure it out in the morning." Emma wanted to believe him. She really did. But the knot of unease in her stomach wouldn't loosen. As night fell, the house seemed to grow colder, the shadows deeper. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like someone, or something, was moving in the dark. She couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to every noise, every whisper of the wind outside. She heard the faint sound of footsteps moving through the hall, slow and deliberate. She tried to convince herself it was just the house settling, but the sound was too rhythmic, too deliberate. At some point, she must have drifted off, because when she opened her eyes again, the moonlight had crept through the window, casting pale light across the room. The house was silent now, almost too silent. She tried to sit up, but something was wrong. The air was thick, heavy, as though it was pressing in on her from all sides. The door to the hallway was open, just a crack. She didn't want to move. Her body refused to obey, her limbs frozen in place. But the door, there was something on the other side. A shape, dark and formless, lingering just beyond the threshold. Emma's heart hammered in her chest as the shape slowly began to take form. It was tall, too tall for any normal person, and its limbs stretched unnaturally, like they were being pulled by some invisible force. She gasped, finally managing to move, and reached for Jake, shaking him awake. "Jake, wake up," she cried, her voice hoarse. But Jake didn't respond. She shook him harder, panic rising in her chest. His eyes were wide open, staring at the ceiling, unblinking. His mouth hung slightly open, his face pale and lifeless. Emma screamed, stumbling back, but the figure in the doorway had already moved closer, its cold eyes locked on hers. "Leave," it whispered. "You shouldn't be here." That's the first part of the story. I can continue in the next segment, building the terror and suspense further. Would you like me to proceed? Here's the next segment of the... Emma's scream echoed through the empty cottage. She scrambled back, her hands trembling as they sought purchase on the cold floor. Her mind raced, trying to process the impossible. The figure that had loomed at the door was real, it was there, and it was getting closer. She tried to call out to Jake again, but her voice caught in her throat. His eyes were wide, frozen in a glassy stare, his body unnaturally stiff. It was as though he was lifeless. The shape in the doorway was now fully formed, towering over her in the dim light, its limbs long and spindly. It moved with a slow, deliberate pace, as though savoring her terror. "Leave," it whispered once more, its voice deep and guttural. "You shouldn't have come." Emma's heart pounded in her chest. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to escape, but her legs wouldn't obey. It was as though the air had turned to lead, weighing her down, anchoring her to the spot. The figure in the doorway tilted its head, its dark eyes reflecting the dim light as if it could see straight into her soul. The room felt colder, the shadows growing longer, more oppressive. Emma forced herself to her feet, her fingers fumbling for anything she could use to defend herself. But there was nothing. No weapon, no way to fight this thing. It was as though the house itself was holding her captive, a prison with no escape. Suddenly, the figure lunged forward. Emma's scream shattered the silence as she staggered backward, falling to the ground. But just as quickly as it had moved, it stopped, hovering inches above her, its face just inches from hers. Its breath, if it could even be called that, was a cold gust, smelling faintly of decay. "You should never have come," it hissed, its voice like 1,000 whispers blending into one. Emma's vision blurred as she tried to push herself up, her body finally responding to the adrenaline surging through her veins. She had to get out. She had to get away from it. She glanced back at Jake, his body still unmoving, but his face now twisted in a grotesque expression of agony. His eyes were wide, but not in fear, something else was there. Something darker. It was then that she realized, Jake wasn't just unconscious. He was possessed. His face seemed to contort unnaturally, his mouth twitching as though trying to form words, but no sound escaped. His body trembled violently, as if it was being controlled by some external force. The figure didn't seem to care about Jake. It was focused solely on Emma, its dark gaze following her every move, its shape growing more defined with each passing second. Emma lay there in the dirt, her mind reeling, her body too exhausted to move. The figure stood over her, its dark shape blocking out the faint moonlight, and for a moment, the world felt completely still. The air was suffocating, thick with the weight of something ancient and malevolent. "You shouldn't have come," it whispered again, its voice both distant and close, reverberating in her ears, as if it were inside her head. Her heart raced, and a cold sweat drenched her skin. She knew that whatever this thing was, it wasn't just part of the house. It had been waiting for her, waiting for someone to dare step into the dark corners of its domain. She could feel its power now, suffocating and overpowering, creeping into her thoughts, twisting them. "Leave," it commanded, but she had already tried. She had already run. With great effort, Emma pushed herself onto her hands and knees, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She had to get away. She couldn't die here, in these woods, lost to whatever horror had taken hold of this place. The figure's cold gaze never wavered as it stood silently, watching her every movement, almost as if it were deciding how to end her suffering. But then, something unexpected happened. The ground beneath her shifted. The earth trembled slightly, and Emma's eyes widened in disbelief as the dirt around her began to sink, slowly, as though something was rising from beneath. A low, guttural rumble echoed through the trees, growing louder and more distinct. She could feel it now, a pressure building up from the ground itself. It wasn't the figure that was causing it, it was something else, something older. A deep crack split the earth, and out of it rose an ancient stone structure, blackened and worn with age. At the center of the stone, a symbol, long forgotten, glowed faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. The figure's posture stiffened, as if it had been startled by the sudden change in the air. Without thinking, Emma scrambled to her feet, her legs trembling with fear and exhaustion. She had no idea what was happening, but she knew that the appearance of this structure was her only chance, her only hope. The figure seemed to notice her movement for the first time, its dark form moving toward her with unnatural speed. Its whispers grew louder, more frantic, but Emma didn't stop. She ran toward the rising stones, desperate to reach the center of the structure, to understand what was unfolding before her eyes. The whispers now screamed in her mind, urging her to turn back, to run. But Emma refused to listen. She was close now. She could see it. At the heart of the stone structure was an altar, ancient and worn, carved with symbols she didn't understand. The earth around it seemed to pulse with power, a force so dark, it made her skin crawl. When Emma reached the altar, she didn't stop. The figure was mere feet behind her now, but she didn't turn to face it. She reached for the symbol at the center of the altar, pressing her palm against it, feeling the warmth radiating from the stone. A shock of energy shot through her body, and for a moment, she thought she might collapse. But then, everything went still. The whispers stopped. The figure froze. And then, a voice, soft and deep, spoke from somewhere within the structure, as though it had always been there, waiting to be heard. "You have broken the cycle," it said, its tone not one of malice, but of release. "The house, the shadows, they were born of fear. Fear that has held us here for centuries." Emma's breath caught in her throat. Was it speaking to her? "The one who enters," the voice continued,